Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to share with you a crazy story from a few years ago when me and my buddies decided to celebrate our high school graduation in the White Mountains National Forest Preserve. It wasn't too far from where we lived, just a couple of hours drive, so we figured, why not? We crammed into my friend Alexis's tiny Hyundai Accent. Seriously, it was a snug fit, along with Rob, his girlfriend Stephanie, and our friend Kelly. We didn't pack much, just the essentials, because we were headed to this Airbnb in Carroll, New Hampshire, right smack dab in the middle of summer. Now let me tell you, the drive up there was absolutely stunning. The scenery, the fresh air, it was the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But when we finally arrived at the house, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly what we expected. Sure, it looked just like it did in the photos online, but what the pictures didn't show was the rundown shed next to the house. I mean, it looked like it had seen better days. Honestly, I wouldn't have been surprised if I could have pushed it over myself. But hey, we didn't let that spoil our excitement. We unloaded our stuff and got ready to kick off our celebration weekend. Little did we know things were about to get a whole lot crazier. You won't believe what happened next. Alexis, always the joker, suggested that maybe some old crazy guy lived in that rundown shed next to the house, hence why the place was so cheap. We all chuckled at the idea and brushed it off, diving into unpacking our things. Now let me give you a little insight into the dynamics going on here. I'll admit, I had a bit of a crush on Alexis, and I had a feeling she felt the same way. Why else would she suggest we share a bed, right? But here's the kicker. She refused to sleep in the third bedroom because it had a direct view of that creepy shed. And guess who she wouldn't let sleep there either? Yours truly. So we ended up making the pull-out couch in the living room our makeshift bed for the night. Fast forward a bit, and we found ourselves chilling in the hot tub in the garage rec room. Alexis cozied up next to me, and together we gazed out at the woods. Meanwhile, Rob and his girlfriend were on the opposite side of the tub. Now here's where things get a little wild. Rob's girlfriend couldn't fully submerge herself in the water because of some stitches she had. Talk about dedication to the party. Stephanie and I, being good pals, kept the conversation flowing, reminiscing about high school and sharing a few laughs over our potentially illegally acquired beverages. Now let me tell you what went down next. While the rest of us were chilling, Kelly had disappeared to change, leaving us momentarily. Then out of nowhere, Rob decided to play footsie underwater, nudging my leg and shooting me a wink. Classic Rob move, right? But hey, it wasn't a big deal. As we soaked in the hot tub, we started brainstorming our plans for the next day, tossing around ideas about hiking to Mount Washington in the Flume Gorge. After a relaxing soak, I snuggled up in bed with Alexis and we kicked back to watch some Rick and Morty. Before we knew it, it was 2 a.m. and we found ourselves outside, ready for some stargazing. Now let me set the scene for you. We were all gathered on this massive deck in front of the house, surrounded by pitch black darkness. There wasn't a car in sight, and we were smack dab in the middle of nowhere. Let me tell you, true silence is something else when you're far away from the hustle and bustle of cars and planes. The sky was painted a breathtaking mix of purple and blue, adorned with countless twinkling stars. It was a sight to behold, let me tell you. Kelly suddenly motioned for me to be quiet, her ears catching the faint sound of crunching just a few feet from the porch. It was as if something was creeping closer to the deck, and I initially brushed it off as just a raccoon or maybe a fox. But then the steps grew heavier and my gaze shifted to Alexis. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I saw her staring towards the old shed where the sounds had originated. That's when the fear started to creep in. Without wasting a moment, I hurriedly ushered the girls inside the cabin and made sure all the doors were securely locked. I tried to reassure them, insisting it was probably just some animal, especially considering how easily they could have taken over that decrepit old shed. Eventually, both of them managed to calm down. As Kelly retreated to her room, I once again settled down beside Alexis. The next morning, I woke up to the aroma of breakfast wafting from the kitchen, where Rob and his girlfriend were already busy cooking, just across the room from Alexis. We had a packed itinerary for the day, and we ended up doing a lot of hiking, with most of us putting last night's events out of our minds, except for Alexis. When we returned from our hike, Alexis suggested checking out the old shed next to the house now that it was daylight. I'll admit I wasn't too keen on the idea, but I also didn't want Alexis to think I was scared. We opened the screen door and began exploring the first room. There was an old, creaky rocking chair that looked like it would fall apart if I even tried to sit in it. The next door had one of those classic brass doorknobs, but it was covered in rust and dents. I glanced at Alexis before grabbing the door handle, and she let out a small groan as we opened the door. The room didn't offer much. The floor was just dirt, with dirt-caked windows and some scattered trash. Alexis pointed out the lingering smell of cigarette smoke, suggesting it might be a designated smoking spot for the Airbnb. We both shrugged it off and rejoined the others outside, where Rob was getting a fire started. As we chatted and enjoyed the evening, Rob teased Alexis and me about something or other, while I took a moment to enhance the ambience by turning off the floodlight. Laughter and stories filled the air until a sudden silence fell upon us. Then that same crunching sound from the previous night echoed from behind us near the tree line. But this time it was faster and heading our way. Suddenly, a flash of green light illuminated the entire backyard for just a moment, causing whatever was approaching us to come to a sudden stop. But before we could process what had happened, Stephanie's piercing scream shattered the silence as she bolted towards the house. And then, behind us, a blood-curdling cry or yelp pierced the night, initially mistaken for a siren. Immediately, I leaped to my feet, urging everyone to rush indoors. Stephanie must have caught sight of whatever had produced that chilling cry as she dashed towards the house. In my haste, I accidentally toppled Kelly, who hadn't fully grasped the situation yet. Hastening to her aid, I glanced back to see Rob already halfway to the house. With a sense of urgency, I hurried to Alexis to gather our belongings, knowing that lingering outdoors could invite trouble, especially if it were a bear. Rushing to the back door, I found Rob waiting with bear spray in hand, while I had already brandished my trusty knife. As we prepared to enter, Rob insisted that he take point, claiming to have the better range. Together, we caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure skulking near the edge of the firelight before retreating inside. After gathering the girls in the living room, we wasted no time in calling the police. Despite a thorough search by the officer, nothing was found except for an explanation of the flash, a nearby lightning strike. As for the mysterious creature, the officer speculated it could have been a fisher cat, but Stephanie insisted she had seen a man draped in a cloak or blanket. Suffice it to say, we didn't stay another night, overwhelmed by the paranoia of being stalked in the woods. Since then, we've steered clear of the mountains, uncertain of the dangers lurking within those dense forests.
During the summer of 2016, my boyfriend Sean and I embarked on a trip to Vermont. Seeking a unique experience, I booked us a stay at an Airbnb listed as an off-grid cabin. With several hundred reviews and a perfect 5-star rating, it seemed like a solid choice. The cabin itself was charming, a rustic one-room setup complete with a potbelly stove and a cozy loft area. Nestled in a remote corner of Vermont, accessed via an old dirt road, it offered seclusion. The host's house, about half a mile away, remained unoccupied during our visit, leaving us alone in the wilderness. Arriving around 4 p.m., we spent a delightful evening cooking dinner and enjoying board games by candlelight after a full day of hiking. By 10 p.m., exhaustion had set in, prompting me to retreat to the loft for some much-needed rest, while Sean opted to relax outside and have a smoke. About 20 minutes later, while I hovered in that hazy realm between deep sleep and consciousness, I was abruptly jolted awake by a thunderous banging sound echoing against the cabin walls. Before I could even gather my thoughts, Sean's voice pierced through the darkness, questioning if the noise originated from me. Confused and disoriented, I mumbled a groggy denial, convinced I must be dreaming. Sean, stationed outside, seemed unperturbed, having witnessed nothing unusual. Given our frequent camping adventures, we were accustomed to strange nocturnal noises, so we brushed it off as perhaps a fallen tree branch colliding with the cabin. Just as I began drifting back into slumber, another resounding thud reverberated from a different part of the cabin, snapping me back to full alertness. Reacting swiftly, I leaped out of bed and descended from the loft to meet Sean at the door. Urged by him to gather any sharp objects within reach, I complied, sensing his underlying anxiety despite his outward calm demeanor. When I inquired about his thoughts on the source of the disturbance, Sean's response was tentative, admitting uncertainty. Although he had detected no signs of intruders during his outdoor vigil, he confessed to a faint suspicion of having heard footsteps. While we exchanged hushed whispers, a faint, deliberate scraping sound sliced through the silence, dragging along the cabin wall for about 3 feet before abruptly ceasing. Fear gnawed at me, rendering me paralyzed with uncertainty. Our car sat parked roughly 100 feet from the cabin, shrouded in darkness, necessitating a daunting trek through the unknown. It dawned on me that this scenario likely played into the hands of whatever lurked beyond, its intentions veiled in shadow. The prospect of encountering a potential human threat loomed large, fueling apprehension that they might sabotage our escape by slashing tires or obstructing the driveway, leaving us vulnerable and stranded in the wilderness. Sean instructed me to maintain absolute silence and retreat to the loft while he stationed himself downstairs, armed with a hunting knife and a sturdy stick. I, on the other hand, clutched a handful of steak knives, our makeshift arsenal in the face of uncertainty. The lower level of the cabin boasted expansive windows on 3 sides, half of which were mere screens, offering little protection from prying eyes or potential intruders. Despite my inclination to remain downstairs, Sean insisted I ascend to the loft, arguing that our chances of defending ourselves would be greater if I were out of harm's way. Reluctantly, I complied, perching myself on the bed, tightly gripping the array of knives in my trembling fists. Every fiber of my being was attuned to the slightest sound as Sean cautiously called out a tentative "hello," hoping for either a response or a deterrent effect on whatever lurked outside, whether human or animal. After what felt like an eternity of eerie silence, the scraping noise returned with a vengeance, echoing louder than before. It resembled the harsh drag of a rake or a hoe against the wooden walls of the cabin, sending shivers down my spine. Accompanying the unsettling sound were distinct, deliberate footsteps, methodically pacing around the perimeter of the cabin. Sean swiftly ascended to the loft, retracting the ladder behind him. He explained his rationale, expressing discomfort at the thought of being visible to potential intruders while unable to discern their presence himself. From our vantage point in the loft, he reasoned, he could gain the upper hand if they attempted to breach the cabin. We huddled together in tense silence on the bed, my gaze fixed on Sean's face, a mirror of my own terror. As the clock approached midnight, the grim reality set in. We were effectively trapped in that cabin until the first light of dawn. The cacophony persisted, growing louder and more unsettling with each passing moment. Banging reverberated from various directions around the cabin, interspersed with the return of the scraping noise. It was evident that these were no ordinary animal sounds. Their rhythmic and methodical nature defied the chaotic randomness of wildlife. There were no accompanying grunts or growls, characteristic of bears or bobcats. Instead, a relentless procession of footsteps echoed around the cabin, each step punctuated by a distinct crunching sound as if someone were pacing deliberately. The unnerving symphony continued in relentless cycles, punctuated by brief intervals of eerie silence. At one point, a peculiar rattling emanated from outside, akin to someone attempting to manipulate or scale the pipe connected to the potbelly stove. The ordeal stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Sean and I remained paralyzed in bed, gripped by silent terror, our eyes locked in mutual fear. I braced myself for the worst, anticipating the sound of the front door being violently breached or the screen window torn apart. Gruesome scenarios played out in my mind, each more horrifying than the last. Despite my overwhelming dread, no intruder materialized. There were no sinister whispers, no deranged laughter, just the relentless cacophony of scraping, banging, rattling, and footsteps echoing through the night. As dawn approached, a faint chorus of roosters signaled the end of our torment. The loft slowly bathed in the soft light of early morning, offering a sliver of respite. With the cessation of the eerie sounds, I managed to steal a couple of hours of restless sleep before we embarked on our journey to Pennsylvania later that day. Thankfully, my car remained unscathed, allowing us to hastily pack our belongings and flee the scene. Despite scouring the cabin for any signs of intrusion, Sean found no evidence, no scraping marks, no footprints. I reached out to the Airbnb host to recount our harrowing experience, only to receive a dismissive response, suggesting it may have been a porcupine. The absurdity of that explanation left us incredulous, fueling ongoing debates about the true nature of our tormentor. Sean suspects it may have been a local resident attempting to frighten us off, but regardless of the explanation, I'm simply grateful that we escaped unharmed that night.